Hello there, and thanks for tuning in to this, our second episode of the Rest is Policing podcast. My name's Martin Bahadur. I'm joined by Lee Broadbent. Hi, Lee.
Hi, Martin. Hope you're well. Hope you're well rested and recovered after the impressive Tottenham.
I am. My voice is struggling. I've got to be honest. I had obviously the game on Wednesday, then the parade on Friday, and I went on Sunday to the Spurs Brighton game and did it all again. So I am struggling a bit with the voice. But as all listeners will know, Spurs don't win that many trophies. So when one comes along, you've got to celebrate it as much as you can. Just to say to everybody as well, thanks to everybody who tuned in. We had some really nice feedback. Some really, really good viewing or listening figures, we should say. We'll get some viewing figures with this as we're going on YouTube with this podcast. But thanks for tuning in. And as mentioned last time, we will set up an email address so people can start to contact us with questions. We had some great feedback. People saying it's really easy to listen to. They really enjoyed it. They wondered what the focus and the point of the campaign was and that we'd explained it really well. So it's nice to hear that obviously the podcast is doing what we set out to achieve. And on that note, Lee, in terms of the Breaking the Monopoly campaign, how is the GoFundMe page? Where are we at, and how's it going?
It's going well. We're just over 85% of our initial target, £15,000. I have a phone call lined up with the solicitors on Friday to officially instruct and get the legal advice. So far so good. Got a little bit more room to go, but we've got enough in the budget to originally instruct now, so which is excellent.
Fantastic. And if people do want to donate, obviously, and go onto Lee's X page and find the link there. But we'll put a link to the GoFundMe page on the YouTube channel as well, so people can go on and support it, which is wonderful. In terms of the campaign and looking forward now, what would the legal challenge? What are you hoping the legal challenge could achieve? What's the talk us through perhaps the path and the steps you're going to go through and what it will look like. What's going to happen in your eyes?
Okay, so breaking it down into its basic format. The challenge, as described in the Breaking the Monopoly paper, is to challenge sections of the Police Act 1996, particularly I think it's section 64 off the top of my head, which prevents police officers from joining any association or union which has for one of its objectives or its main objectives to influence the pay, conditions and service and pensions of police officers. That obviously restricts or funnels police officers into one organisation because the legislation simply only recognises the Police Federation of England and Wales. What we're arguing is that we feel that is a breach of our Article 11 human rights, that essential prevention from us allowing us to form, us freely associate, freely assemble under a banner of our own choosing, especially where the organisation which we're funnelled into is underperforming and not acting in the interests of a good proportion of its members. We say that is a clear breach of Article 11 of the Human Rights Act. Not only that, the legislation was written at a time when the labour movement, let's say, was probably a bit more rife and employer-employee relations a bit more turbulent. We don't think that we're in that kind of period. And even if we were, police officers are generally reasonable, well-read, aligned to following an evidence base and aren't necessarily ones to throw the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to our relationship with chief constables. And so we think the law's archaic, the evidence of an underperforming staff association is clear and stark, and we think that a challenge under Article 11 of the Human Rights Act would be successful in overturning the restrictions that are in place at present.
Right, okay. When we get to the point where you're bringing the case forward, you've got the funding, can the government ignore you? What would the choice look like for the government? Are they obliged to respond, or can they just sort of say, look, we're too busy to deal with this at the moment? What will happen at that point, do you think?
My understanding is that they would be obliged to act. If a ruling is arrived upon which agrees with our argument, then the current legislation as it stands would be incompatible with the Human Rights Act. So the government would have to make amendments to the legislation to make it compatible. How the government went about doing that, again, they may have a degree of flexibility, but the court can issue a set of recommendations in order to assist the government in achieving that objective of making the Act compatible with the Human Rights Act. And those recommendations can be drawn up or contributed to by interested parties, and certainly by those seeking to challenge, because at the end of the day, if hopefully when the challenge is successful, officers who have funded the challenge, who have brought this, will have a view of what they want their new representative bodies, because it could be a number of bodies, it doesn't have to be one. Again, that is open to the government as to how it words legislation to solve that. But no, it wouldn't be able, the government would not be able to simply ignore a court ruling which says that the current legislation is incompatible with the Human Rights Act, and that the restrictions of only allowing officers to join one representative body has to be changed.
Right, gotcha. Okay, so it's and how far in your thinking are you? Because one of the questions we actually had from somebody on the Spotify account was, what would this actually look like in terms of if you achieve what you're hoping to achieve, what will the options be for police officers? Would it be, do you want to join a new staff association? You can stay with the Police Federation, or would they have to go in and physically leave the federation to opt to join you? And what would the choice look like, and how would police officers be able to take that choice? What would they need to do?
And I get this because I get asked the same question, and to be quite frank and open, you're delving into a little bit of the unknown, because even if the law was changed tomorrow, there wouldn't necessarily be a viable alternative that police officers would be willing to join. Now, I've heard, I think it's an ever-present feeling in the back of officers' minds, given the way the College of Policing was introduced many years ago, was to set up to be this umbrella organisation. There was always a fear that was going to be the replacement of any federation, and officers were going to be simply funneled into the College of Policing. But I would argue that simply would not work. It's quite clear that officers are unhappy with the current situation, in that they haven't got choice. Opening it up to just two bodies, being the Police Federation and the College of Policing, is still a forced choice. Anything that needs to work, or that would have to work, would have to have the buy-in of police officers from the start. And that's where we're getting to that little bit of an unknown. My proposition is that the campaign isn't just a campaign, so to speak. It's a movement. It's a movement of people that are contributing to a campaign, one to show support and one to say that we want to come together under this new umbrella, whatever that may look like down the line, and form into this association, which clearly aligns with a lot of people's viewpoints. The Pension Challenge Group, have been quite strong in our previous endeavours and campaigns in acting ethically, acting with a sense of purpose, which is driven by consultation and communication with those that are on our various social media pages, transparent in our dealings, highly accountable. We don't just take our own decisions and move forward on them, or we don't withhold information on what we're doing. The fact that I'm saying there's a degree of vagueness over what that future might be is evident of the fact that we are very open in our engagement with people that are supporting us. So yes, there is a degree of stepping into the unknown. What that would look like, who knows? And I suppose this is where we have to be cautious to a certain degree, because it would be nice to set up a body now and say, come and form under us and we'll move this forward. But we have to be mindful that currently the regulations prevent officers from joining any group or association that has for its purpose to control pay, conditions, and service. If what we're saying is, yes, we're looking at the minute, two separate things. We are looking to change the piece of legislation. There is nothing unlawful about officers wanting to back and get behind that. But as it comes to joining a new representative body from the start, there might be a bit of pushback. So we put the groundwork in, we get things put in place for a time where the legislation changes, and then we say, right, you backed us for the pension challenge, you backed us in our campaign against PFEW, you backed us in our campaign to break the monopoly, we've done all those things, join us, we'll make a new representative body.
Right, fantastic. And I think it's interesting because when we launched the first podcast, some of the comments that we had on social media, or certainly you did, were from people that you perhaps worked with previously at the federation who are no longer there, who said, if you get this off the ground, let me know and I'll jump on board with the new staff association. So what would that? I guess a big part of the job for you is setting up a staff association as you're doing it because you believe that the police federation is no longer fit for purpose. Is how do you then set up a staff association that is fit for purpose, and what does that staff association look like? How do you create that? What would be the first step? So you're successful. They've given you the go ahead. What happens at that point? I don't know. That probably touches on what you've just said, which is a bit of a blank canvas at the moment, and it's a moving feast. But for people who are asking, what would a new staff association look like in terms of how you'd go about creating it?
Well, I mean, again, this is new to me as it is to anybody else, but the Federation was in a similar position when it first started in 1919. There wasn't a formal structure in place. The former officers of the National Police and Prison Officers Union, which was disbarred under the new legislation. Some of those officials transferred into the new Police Federation, and it worked with government to outline its structures and the way it was set up. What the key thing for me is that we wouldn't be looking to replicate, because replication just means that we're duplicating what has gone wrong. There's something within the Federation structures and its authoritarian setup. Maybe that's aligned with policing and the rank structure that we're in the discipline service and we're so akin to following rank, and there's secrecy around decision making, or there's a sense of individual ownership and as opposed to a collective ownership, which feels alien to policing. There's something within that has gone fundamentally wrong when it comes to representation of police officers, because a union or an association should be a collective. It should be about bringing those people with you, as many as you can, on the journey with you, as opposed to dictating that this is where we're going. And so one of the things that we have looked at in terms of how a new association might look is to give each individual member a share. So every month subscription equates to a reissuing of that share, which gives you a contributory right in terms of voting on governance, in terms of voting on who is going to be in position to lead the organisation, any key financial decisions or changes to the organisation, so that the membership are kept engaged. So that's something that we're being looked at. How do we go about setting that up? Well, that will heavily rely on what parameters the government allow any new association to be set up in, because the association, the government may decide that the system or set of legislative rules that govern the federation should equally apply to any new association, albeit you can create or change your name, but there might be some parity of fairness. So all that could be quite new, but that's a really interesting thing to try and explore as well, because members can get engaged to push back and feed into this direction. If we're not happy with a certain proposal, well, let's get the weight of the membership behind you to try and change that. And if we've got 10,000 people donating into a campaign to change it, and we've got 10,000 individual voices petitioning to say this is where we want to go, then the creation and the direction of any new association is entirely in the hands of those people that are pushing it.
Absolutely. Funnily enough, I when I was editor of Police Oracle, I wrote an article about. Funnily enough, I was planning on writing a book about the history of policing. So I was going up to Brighton on Dunsmore College of Policing. I had access to all the old police reviews, and I wrote an article about how the federation was set up in 1919. And we actually we reproduced it in the police magazine. I'll try and find it and put a link to it if I can. But one of the things that got me was how it's very, as you said, that I remember it was something like, for example, it wasn't these specific dates, but on the Monday that they were out, so they didn't know that when it was going to be set up, and by that Wednesday, the police federation had been set up. It was like it
Created.
happened so quickly because they generated that a huge number of they had a huge number of officers out with them, and it just sort of really it snowballed into something huge. But I'll try and dig the article out because it just shows what happened. It's funny, 100 years on, here we are.
Yeah, and the thing is, key into that as well was the amount of people that were behind that movement. You know, some people didn't agree with the formation of the federation, hence
Mm.
why you had the further strikes in Liverpool. Um, so there was a collective of people that said, actually, no, we're giving away too much, and I don't agree with that. But that failed because the majority of people went with the federation. They had choice to some degree, although albeit the unions were outlawed at that point. But they had a body of people that went with them. They had a body of people that invested in this new organisation that set it up. And for the best part of its, would inauguration be the right word? But the
Mm.
best part of its starting or fledgling um, creation, the federation was successful. It
Yeah.
achieved what it set out to achieve. Huge pay rises, increases in terms and conditions. It had levers and access to key government officials, unlike most union officials. The federation had direct access to secretaries of state, direct access to chief constables, and it had a credible basis on which to do that. The fact it's lost that over time is down to itself, but the membership deserve better.
Yeah, I always wonder if you went back to 1919 and asked those setting it up how they envisaged what they thought it would look like in 100 years, I'd imagine they wouldn't be thinking it would be as it is now. I guess when I was at the federation, one of the things that got me was like the size of it. It's obviously a huge organisation, and it's trying to work out how it could best the mechanics, how it could best work. So I guess when I was there and people would talk about how does it save money, and one of the things I used to think I'm not sure the National Council needs to be as big as it is. We'd have those conversations. We'd kind of say, do you need a branch chair and a branch secretary for each branch? Or do you need a regional one in region one in region two, three, four, five, six, seven, eight? And it's interesting because obviously the independent review has now come up with something very similar. It's said, I think,
Mm.
and I think anyone that comes from the corporate world, as I did, or anyone that comes from a background different to policing, would probably look at it and go, "Yeah, this is just too big. This is just mad." But if you're in it and that's all you've known, it's hard to perhaps see that it needs to be reduced. What in your head, if you're successful and you set up a rival staff association, how would you set it up? What would you see is that how do you get around those issues so you need something regionally, you need something nationally, they need to work together. And I think that's the biggest issue that the federation has sometimes, regions and national working together. How do you get around it, and how do you keep it to a level that's sustainable in terms of the number of people involved?
That's a really interesting point, because I do think there is a great opportunity to go for a regional sort of representative model. As you say, I think the individual branch mechanism doesn't work. My own experience of the individual branches, and I know there will be branch chairs and secretaries out there that will vehemently disagree with me on this one, but my thing, I always saw it as the branches serve to some effect to make fiefdoms, individual empires for the people who are happy and content with staying where they were locally and disinterested in what the national were doing. And that created a friction and a barrier where the branch became protective of itself, the national became protective of itself, and there was no joined up collective organisation, so to speak. And that fundamentally leads to a breakdown, because the membership then see the national as isolated. They have more buy-in to some degree with local branches, because local branches make it that way. Local branches will promote what they do above what the national do in order to keep that buy-in and to keep people interested at a local level. But then they don't hold or have the ability to hold the national to account because of the breakdowns in the relationships and the distrust, etc. So you need to get around that in creating a smaller working body. And I think it was recognised in Normanton. It was recognised, as you say, in the new review. The national board is too big. The National Council is too big. each of these individual collective bodies failed wholeheartedly in what they were supposed to be doing over the last 20 years, because it was too big, because debate was stifled, there were too many potentially competing voices, so to speak, and there wasn't one joined up approach. If you shrank that down to something which was still in touch with its membership, or kept that credible, accessible approach to the membership, but could operate on a regional level, when we're looking at pay, conditions of service, pensions, overtime usages, deployment to other organisations, all this works on a regional or national level and impacts on the individual. But the organisation, as it's currently set up in PFEW, isn't structured to respond sufficiently. So yes, a smaller body would be much, much better.
It is interesting because I think a lot of the problems that the Federation had come about because of its size. It's a bit like, for example, you've got a staff association that campaigns again, and we're going to talk about PFEW whistle in a bit, just because obviously everybody wants to know more about that.
Not me.
Well, let's do it then, because I saw on social media they tweeted something, and then somebody replied to it saying Lee or whatever. So they obviously, but my first thought was, well, it was an account that was then deleted. It was really weird. But you tweet very critical bits and pieces about the Federation anyway. So my first thought was, if you were, why wouldn't you not just do it from your own account? You wouldn't need to set up a whistleblowing account, would you?
No, I've always held that position. There was a time when I know John Apter was coming under a lot of stick from a John Apter parody account, and
Yeah.
that was levelled at me as well. I've never set up any parody account. I've never set up any third party account. I understand why people do that, but I think one of my unique selling points is that I nail my heart to the mast, so to speak. I'm quite willing to put my controversial view out there and say, it's me. If I overstep the mark, equally, I'm happy to be challenged on it and to receive advice, reflective practice. I don't do anything to misconduct myself intentionally, but I'm quite happy and prepared to own my controversial view, so to speak.
Absolutely. What do you think of the work? Because again, you look at the replies to that account, and there's a lot where people say, "This is great. This is what was needed." It's encouraging debate, and maybe there are elements that have come out from within the Police Federation because of the whistleblowing account, and there are others that say, this should be kept, private to the Police Federation. They're trying to deal with things. Where do you sit on that? Well, in terms, is it a good thing for this kind of account to be whistleblowing information from within the Federation? Has it got us to a point where things are that maybe there is more change and that people are now more aware of what's going on, or is it actually just negative media feedback on a constant basis? Where do you sit on it?
That's a really, really good question. I think if everything was working as it should be doing within any organisation, then the need for any whistleblower wouldn't exist. Because if an organisation had a feedback loop within it, where a person raising a complaint feels adequately listened to and that feels that the complaint's been adequately dealt with, you wouldn't need then to break through any barriers, so to speak, to share the story, because the organisation would be one that is reflective and considerate of the complaint. The fact that whistleblower exists is testament to a failed organisation or a failing organisation, and it's testament to a culture within the organisation which says that if you raise a complaint or you raise a separate viewpoint than the one that is widely adopted within the organisation, you will not be listened to. You will be silenced, you will be crushed, and therefore people have no option but to create shadow accounts or go elsewhere, for instance. Whistleblower, it made me laugh when it first popped along. It was very revealing. I think whistleblower, the account, it does serve a purpose. If people are still sharing information with whistleblower, then there's still a need to put it out there. Whistleblower would not exist. I think that's what I'm getting at. Whistleblower would not exist if the organisation was in a position that it should be. If it was that effective, credible organisation which had true diversity of thought, true diversity of representation, and people felt comfortable and empowered to raise the concerns without being shut down, investigated, suspended, dismissed, then it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If PFEW gets its act in order, PFEW whistleblower wouldn't exist.
Yeah, and it looked from obviously the amount of information that is shared from that account, it feels like there's a lot of there's a lot of information going there, which is interesting. I think one of the things I always remember, obviously, I worked in comms there and at other places, and if you look at something like the most controversial aspect at the moment is salaries, and to a point where, or one salary in particular, where it's almost overshadowing everything. And I kind of look at it and go, if I was still head of comms at the Police Federation, I'd be saying, right, if you believe this salary is too high, then you've got to own it and you've got to explain why, because you can't just not say what it is, and you can't let people speculate as to what it is, because that's going to get out of control. And I always remember when I was editing papers in North London, and one of my papers was the Barnet Times, and Barnet Borough Council were probably the most controversial council at the time. There were loads of things going on. It was I'm not going to show. Well, I can show my political colours. It was a typical Tory borough council. It was ridiculous. And I remember one story dropped, and it was like it was a bit of a non-story. We were like, anyway, I put it on page 11, and we went to the council for a comment, and they denied it. But we had the evidence was ridiculous that we had. So we're like, well, we're going to run this story, and then the more they denied it, the more lies they told. So the story went from 11 to page 9, and then it went to page 7, and they kept on digging and digging, because the council leader was adamant this wasn't true, although we had the evidence, and it was just a cover-up. So it got to a point where the cover-up was bigger than the actual story, and it ended up on the front page. From the front page, it ended up on Sky, BBC, everywhere, and the council leader resigned. And it was ridiculous, because if they just told us the truth, it would have been on page 11 or 12, and no one would have seen it. I'm not saying that's the case with the Police Federation, but I think that's where sometimes when you look at some of the things that go on, you just think you've just got to own it. You've got to own the problems you're creating, instead of burying your head in the sand and denying things, or denying there's an issue and saying, yeah, everyone's fine and nobody asks us these questions when we're out and about. It's all anyone's talking about. And at some point, you've got to grasp the nettle and go, yeah, we've got to own this.
Correct. Openness is always the best policy.
Yeah, it is bizarre. Go on, sorry.
I find it quite thingy. I mean, I've always held the view that I'm not necessarily against the position of a CEO within the organisation. I think, as you've mentioned, the Federation has become an unwieldy beast. It handles millions of pounds a year and has a membership base that across 100,000 people. Police officers haven't necessarily got the correct skills to manage a business of that scale. So to have that external credible support to do that isn't a bad thing in any way, shape or form. The problem that's come about in the relationship to this one is the way that the position has been introduced, created, and the secrecy around it. They've created their own story to some degree. If they'd just come out and said, look, this is what we're doing, this is how we're doing it, and this is what we're paying and compensating, it would have gone. But the fact that there's not been anything pinned to it creates and fuels this speculation, and it creates a resentment, because you've got an organisation here that is supposed to align to the principles of transparency, openness, honesty, integrity, all those things that run through police officers like Blackpool through Rock, and it behaves in a completely opposite way.
It's a really interesting thing, that, and again, I'm not going to say anything that's unknown here. In terms of the Police Federation, the Police Federation has a whistleblowing policy in terms of supporting police officers that whistleblow.
But nothing for itself.
We know what they think of whoever the person that's whistleblowing the organisation. They're against, I think, financial agreements for people leaving the role, but then do that. And I speak as somebody that's worked for the Federation, has left, and cards on the table. I've signed an agreement with the Federation. So I won't say anything controversial against it, but it's interesting, isn't it? Because I've seen you've tweeted a fair amount about NDAs and financial agreements. Should an organisation like the Police Federation be behaving in that way, or should it be, using the things like that to potentially get itself out of a sticky situation with
No,
a departing employee.
no, absolutely not. I mean, yeah, this is one of the fundamental frustrations that I have with the Police Federation to some degree. And you'll notice on some of my tweets, I'm calling it, here's another shocking example of do as I say, not as I do. And the Federation are grinding itself down in this kind of behaviour to the point which then makes it impossible to put up a good argument. There is absolutely nothing wrong with the position that it advocated on NDAs. You know, it was strong in that position and challenged chief constables that NDAs should not be used to hide criminal behaviour, bullying behaviour, sexism, misogyny. They should not be used to silence people that have been brave enough to make strong complaints. And then for the organisation to seemingly utilise things in that way, it's a shocking example. What credibility do you have with the police chief then? I'm saying, just for example, I'm going to pluck a force out of the hat. Let's say Derbyshire. If Derbyshire were doing a similar thing with NDAs, or it turned out that people within the organisation were raising serious concerns around racism or sexism, but those concerns were being silenced by overburdening NDA. Well, the Federation should be the organisation, the credible voice that says that's wrong. We're going to highlight it. We're going to push to make this stop. Can't make those arguments while it's embroiled in that similar behaviour.
Yeah, and I guess we sit here now, and there'll be some within the Federation, I'd imagine, who might see this podcast as controversial, even though we're just talking about things that are in the public domain. So, and I've got, and I'm sure you have as well. I've got a lot of people that I'm still in contact with in Leatherhead who I consider friends and people who work there and are brilliant people and are brilliant at what they do. And there's some really, really good people there. I guess when you see the Federation using terms like, in someone like, I don't know if they used it in any particular case, I won't name names, but when you hear phrases like internal terrorists and the kind of terminology they're using, what would you, first of all, how do you react to something like that? And also, if people do believe that what you're doing is controversial in setting up this campaign, and what I'm doing by holding this podcast with you is controversial, what would you say to them? How would you explain to them the thought process? Because there might be some who believe that perhaps I was an internal terrorist when I was there, and you were when you were there. So, what would you say to those people? Because I guess most people that I speak to eventually come to the same conclusion that I did when I left the Police Federation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll start off by saying, I am probably a typical internal terrorist in terms of what you would say that would pit it at as from the Federation. But I think the key mistake that sometimes that people make in seeing challenge or seeing the alternative voice or opinion to their own, effectively, challenging an individual's authority or structure. They don't see it as the strength that it can be in terms of actually, these are people who are passionate about something, who see something, who want to change it, that have got a very, very strong moral compass. They're not just acting out of spite because they dislike a person. They're acting because they see a problem and they think they can fix it and they want to fix it. So to then have their energy, their ideas, their enthusiasm turned back round on them, they're pitched as an internal terrorist. Well, not only is it demotivated, but ultimately it's ruinous of the organisation, because then you just get an echo chamber, an authoritative command structure, which is what we've got now. And policing's been guilty of this over the years. Policing, I think, to some degree, has learned to embrace the moral rebel, because from that embrace, you do get new ideas, you do get challenges to systems, and you do get improvement. So yeah, I would just say listen. And I'll be first off. There are people that I am in conversation with today, that I am helping and supporting today, that I probably wouldn't have found myself helping or supporting even 1 or 2 years ago. And it's not because I've changed. It's because there's been that realization within the organisation itself that the structures, practices, policies, the culture is just wrong, and we find ourselves in that position. And it's when I have challenged on the back of the pension challenge, on the back of the PFEW challenge, to say this is a collective failing, this is onus of all the people within the National Council and National Board. That's not to say that should point the finger at these people, but it's to challenge them to recognise where they may have gone wrong and to challenge them to open their eyes and say, what else have we missed here? What else do we need to look at within our own organisation to change it for the better? If you just put your blinkers on, you carry on regardless, then you're just going to doomed to make the same mistakes. And I'm not saying I'm going to be right on everything. I've got plenty of people that would want to do my legs, but I'm doing it for the right reasons.
Yeah, and I think there's something about like we said, owning your mistakes, isn't there? There's something about somebody just when you get something wrong, admitting it and putting it right, rather than just continuing to just bury your head in the sand, or even double down and potentially make things worse.
Absolutely. One of the first conversations you have as a rep with an officer that's in trouble is, right, what happened? Did you do it? Is what's being said accurate reflection? If it's not, fair enough, let's go into it. But if it is, and we've made a mistake, let's own this early. Let's get ahead of what's coming. If it's a simple mistake, it's a mistake. Where we go wrong is when you, as you alluded to before, is when you try to dig out of that mistake and you lie, and then the honesty and integrity behind it comes worse than the actual original, let's say, incivility complaint. So yeah, I mean the legislation, the regulations were set up to encourage learning, encourage early reflection, because that's how you drive culture changes. If you have a punitive system in place, where as we're going back to now with the the changes around the presumption of guilt at gross misconduct and the presumption that you will be dismissed, the vetting decisions, all you're creating are authoritarian cultures and cultures of fear. And people won't speak out in those cultures. If you've done something wrong, you're less likely to go, sorry, boss, I made a mistake. And you're more likely to go, right, I'm staying silent and I'll need to know what you've got before I say anything. So you're dragging the whole process out. You're costing thousands of pounds. You're driving wedges between people. You're disincentivizing learning. You just need to step out of it. Just step back. We're going too fast.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was working with a client last year. I won't say the name, but they made a mistake, and this was a company, and they were getting there were a lot of newspapers chasing them down for quotes, which I was dealing with, and I just said to the managing director, just say sorry, just admit it and say sorry. There's nowhere to go, and which he did, and it went from I think 6 or 7 papers being interested in the story to one, and it ended up being like a 100-word story. Nothing happened, and it's sometimes, as I said, using that the example I gave earlier. So I think sometimes when you're particularly for media, but also for people on social media now, if somebody's done something wrong and they continue to deny it, they feed that fire. When they kind of go, actually, I got this completely wrong, I'm really sorry, everyone just kind of goes, oh, well, let's move on to the next one. Who's next? It's amazing how it happens.
There might be a small percentage of people that want to drive home and cancel you for that. But that's amplified at social media. We have to remember that social media is not the real world. The majority of people are like ourselves. And if we can accept an apology and accept a mistake and accept the apology for what it generally is, ownership of that mistake and the commitment to learn, grow, and not make that mistake again, most people will have that. They'll accept it and they'll say, okay, thank you for that. And we'll draw a line under it.
It also shows credibility, doesn't it? Because I always think, certainly whenever I was in a position, I think you've always you take responsibility and you try and take responsibility for your team or whatever, and you try and foster that culture. And it almost sets a new culture, doesn't it? It sets a precedent. People then they see you and they say, "Oh, this person's got integrity and credibility," because they can actually own the mistakes that they've made rather than trying to shift it onto other people or to blame. And it's certainly a cultural thing, as you say. I think at a number of places, and probably the Federation has been one of them, where there's a big issue there that seems to just have turned into something else, and it's grown legs and run and been allowed to run.
Yeah, correct. And I've been fascinated by the culture thing because, especially in big organisations where you expect that everybody has to fit under this one umbrella. Policing, prime example. It's an organisation or a system made up of 140,000 individuals. You're not all going to think the same. You're not all going to share the same political views. You might have a key theme that runs through you: honesty, integrity, accountability, those kind of things. But your cultures change within your departments as dictated by the organisation. If you've got a culture which wants to promote, let's say, statistics over real-term policing, then the culture will shift with the demands that the top set. Although you'll have micro cultures that might be rebellious and micro cultures that will set good behaviours, or maybe some will ignore some certain practices. You know, it's really interesting to try and break out how you change that organisational culture to a much wider level. Stephen Watson, as much to some, you know, I disagree with him on a number of things, but he when we once had a meeting, he explained that in empowering sergeants within his organisation, giving them the degree of control and onus, and letting them know that he has their back when they make tough decisions, he's setting that micro culture on each team. You know, it's saying these are the standards that I want adopting as a bare minimum. We might have disagreements, or we might not agree on everything, kind of thing. But as a bare minimum, these are my expectations. You'll be good, hardworking, decent, honest people, committed to doing the best you can possibly do in order to deliver the best service you can possibly achieve. Bare minimum standard. You set that onto all your little sergeants. They will then set the micro cultures within their teams, and then the culture goes upwards. So I can see what he's trying to do. The problem is if you have the wrong culture or the wrong kind of leadership directions from the top, then the whole thing will break down as it goes.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just thinking actually when I just said about taking responsibility and trying to, you know, all the colleagues I had rows with during my time in the police federations, heads exploding, going, "Oh my God, he never did that when he was there." It's about me. So I was thinking, but it's also about learning, isn't it, and moving forward. So
correct.
It's an interesting one. Anyway, look, this has been really good. I think we'll leave it there, Lee. I think our plans are, we'll see. We're going to start getting some special guests on our podcast, aren't we? So we'll see if we can set something up for the next time. But what we'll do is we'll try and leave some links below, certainly to the GoFundMe page and to and an email address if people want to send us their thoughts. But please do comment on Spotify, comment on YouTube, tell us what you think, and tell us if there's any subjects you want us to go into, because we'll also start to talk about more generally about policing. This is called The Rest is Policing, so we'll try and do that, and we'll go from there. So thanks again, Lee, and thanks to everybody for tuning in.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. And to anybody, if you haven't already donated and you feel like you can, please visit the GoFundMe page, throw us a pint, and we much appreciate it. And thank you to all those that have already supported.
Brilliant. Yeah, come on, buy Lee a pint. If you promised to buy Lee a pint all those years ago, yeah, come good. It's not Lee's fault that a pint's now £10.
No,
when you offered it was £4.
Inflation.
Brilliant. Okay, we'll see you next week.
Thanks very much.
Lee.
Cheers,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Bye now.
Bye.